You can tell a lot about a man by the way he handles being laughed at. The voice over the loudspeaker was announcing the start of the Marine Corps Heritage Leadership Symposium, but almost nobody in the packed auditorium at Camp Pendleton was paying attention anymore. Their attention had drifted toward an old man sitting alone in the third row. Thomas Walker looked completely out of place. At 86 years old, with silver hair combed neatly back and a faded olive jacket resting over a plain button-down shirt, he seemed more like a grandfather who had wandered into the wrong building than someone who belonged among active-duty Marines. Around him sat officers in crisp uniforms, senior NCOs with rows of ribbons, and young Marines carrying themselves with the confidence of people who believed they understood exactly how the world worked. Thomas sat quietly with his hands folded over a weathered leather cap resting in his lap. His posture was relaxed. His expression was calm. He seemed entirely unaffected by the curious glances being thrown his way. Captain Nathan Reed noticed him the moment he entered the room. Reed was 32 years old, sharp-jawed, ambitious, and widely respected inside his unit. He had graduated near the top of every course he had attended. He believed in standards. He believed in order. Most importantly, he believed he could identify who belonged and who did not. From the far side of the room, Thomas Walker immediately stood out as someone who did not belong. Reed watched as several Marines glanced toward the old man before exchanging amused looks with one another. The symposium was restricted. Attendance required approval. Yet somehow this elderly stranger had found his way inside. Reed adjusted the sleeves of his service uniform and started walking across the room. Several Marines noticed his movement and followed with interest. The old man still hadn't moved. He simply sat there, watching the stage with the same quiet focus he had maintained since arriving nearly 20 minutes earlier. Reed stopped beside him. "Sir," he said loudly enough for nearby Marines to hear. "Are you lost?" A few heads turned immediately. Thomas looked up. His pale blue eyes met the captain's. There was no confusion in them. No embarrassment. No irritation. Just a steady calm that somehow made Reed feel as though he had interrupted something important. "No," Thomas answered. His voice was low and gravelly. "I'm exactly where I was asked to be." Reed smiled politely, though the edge underneath was impossible to miss. "Interesting," he said, "because this event isn't open to the public." Several Marines nearby smirked. Thomas nodded once. "I understand." Reed waited for an explanation. None came. The silence lingered. Around them, conversations began to fade as more people sensed something unfolding. Reed folded his arms. "Then maybe you can explain how you got in here." Thomas glanced toward the stage again before returning his gaze to the captain. "Someone invited me." The answer only made the younger officer more suspicious. "Someone," Reed repeated. "That's a pretty broad answer." Thomas offered the faintest hint of a smile. "It's the correct one." A few Marines chuckled. Reed heard them and felt his confidence grow. Whatever this was, the old man wasn't taking him seriously, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Most people became nervous when questioned by a Marine captain. Most people rushed to explain themselves. Thomas Walker simply sat there as though none of this mattered, as though he had experienced far more important things than the opinion of a 32-year-old officer. Reed leaned slightly closer. "You know," he said, drawing another laugh from the nearby crowd. "This would go a lot faster if you just told me who you are." Thomas looked at him for several seconds. Then he slowly picked up the old leather cap from his lap and rested it against his knee. "Names aren't usually the important part," he said quietly. The answer was simple, but for reasons Reed couldn't explain, it made the room feel just a little colder. Captain Nathan Reed held the old man's gaze for another second before straightening his posture. Around them, the atmosphere inside the auditorium continued to shift. Conversations had faded into scattered whispers. Marines who had been focused on the stage now watched openly. Some were amused. Others simply sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Reed was not accustomed to being ignored, and he was certainly not accustomed to being answered with riddles. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected softly off rows of polished brass and neatly pressed uniforms, while the low hum of the air conditioning drifted through the room. Yet somehow the quiet around Thomas Walker seemed heavier than all of it. Reed glanced toward the registration table near the entrance. Every attendee had checked in. Every name had been verified. Procedures existed for a reason. Standards existed for a reason. And this old man, sitting calmly in the middle of a restricted symposium, fit neither. All right, Reed said, forcing a pleasant smile. Let us make this simple. Who invited you? Thomas adjusted the brim of the old leather cap resting against his knee. The cap looked worn by decades of use. Its edges were faded. The stitching had been repaired more than once. Yet he handled it with the care of someone holding something valuable. Someone who thought I should be here, he answered. A few younger Marines laughed quietly. Reed heard them. He also noticed that Thomas never once looked embarrassed. Most civilians would have become uncomfortable by now. Most would have rushed to explain themselves. Thomas Walker remained perfectly at ease. That confidence bothered Reed more than he cared to admit. You know, Reed said, folding his arms. There are easier ways to answer a question. Thomas nodded. There usually are. The response triggered another ripple of laughter. Reed felt himself becoming the center of a performance he no longer controlled. He looked around the room. Nearly 24 Marines were now watching. A pair of senior staff sergeants near the back exchanged curious glances. Even some officers seated closer to the stage had turned in their chairs. Reed took a slow breath. He reminded himself that professionalism mattered. The old man was probably harmless. But something about him refused to fit the picture Reed had created in his mind. Thomas did not look nervous. He did not look lost. If anything, he looked patient, as though he had seen this exact situation before. Reed pulled a small attendee list from a folder tucked under his arm. He scanned several names. Nothing matched. No Thomas Walker. No guest registration. No visitor authorization. Reed looked up again. Your name is not on the list. Thomas nodded once more. That does not surprise me. Reed stared at him. The answer made no sense. Yet the old man delivered it with complete certainty. Nearby, a gunnery sergeant named Marcus Hale had been watching the exchange from across the room. At first he had ignored it. Marine officers challenged misplaced visitors all the time. But something about the elderly man kept drawing his attention back. It was not the clothes. It was not the age. It was the stillness. The quiet confidence. The way he carried himself. Marcus could not explain it, but the old man reminded him of photographs he had seen years ago in an archive room deep inside a training facility. Men whose stories were rarely discussed. Men whose names had become legends long before Marcus was born. And for the first time, he found himself wondering whether Captain Reed was asking the wrong questions. Captain Nathan Reed slipped the attendee list back into his folder and took another look at the old man seated before him. The symposium had not even officially begun, yet attention across the auditorium had shifted away from the stage and settled almost entirely on Thomas Walker. The large projection screen glowed softly above the empty podium. Rows of Marines filled the seats beneath it, but very few were paying attention to the schedule anymore. Reed could feel their eyes. He could hear the occasional whisper moving through the room like a slow breeze. Nobody wanted to miss whatever happened next. Reed forced a polite smile that did little to hide his growing irritation. Sir, since your name is not on the list, maybe you can at least tell me what unit brought you here. Thomas rested both hands on the leather cap in his lap. His expression never changed. A long time ago, people stopped asking that question. A few Marines laughed. One young lieutenant shook his head. Another leaned toward his friend and whispered something that earned a grin. Reed noticed all of it. The old man was becoming a source of entertainment, and somehow that made Reed even more determined to get a straight answer. Well, Reed said, today I am asking it. Thomas glanced toward the stage. The overhead lights reflected softly in his pale blue eyes. Then today you may not get one. More laughter followed. Reed felt heat rise into his face. He was no longer conducting a simple verification. He was losing control of the interaction. Across the room, Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Hale continued watching. Every instinct told him something was wrong. Not dangerous. Not threatening. Just wrong. The old man carried himself with a confidence Marcus had seen only a handful of times during his career. It was not arrogance. It was something quieter. Something earned. Thomas never tried to impress anyone. He never raised his voice. Yet somehow he remained the calmest person in a room filled with Marines. Reed took a step closer. You know, most people would simply answer a question from a Marine officer. Thomas nodded. Most people would. The response triggered another wave of amusement from nearby seats. Reed exhaled slowly. He suddenly realized that every answer the old man gave seemed to make him appear more frustrated while making Thomas appear more composed. It was an imbalance he could not explain. Near the front row, a major glanced over his shoulder to observe the situation. Even a few senior officers were paying attention now. Reed knew he needed to end this. He looked directly at Thomas. Fine, he said. Let us try something simpler. For the first time, Thomas turned fully toward him. The room seemed to grow quieter. Even the distant hum of the ventilation system felt muted. Reed studied the weathered face before him. There were deep lines around the eyes. Decades of experience seemed etched into every feature. Yet there was no sign of uncertainty, no sign of fear. Reed folded his arms. If you served, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the surrounding seats. What did people call you? Thomas did not answer immediately. His gaze settled on Reed. Several Marines leaned forward in anticipation. Marcus Hale felt a strange tension tighten in his chest. Something about the question felt important, though he could not explain why. Thomas lowered his eyes briefly toward the old leather cap resting in his lap. When he looked back up, the faintest trace of memory seemed to pass across his face before disappearing again. Then he spoke 4 quiet words. That depends on when. And suddenly nobody in the room was laughing anymore. The silence that followed seemed to settle over the auditorium like a heavy blanket. Captain Nathan Reed waited, expecting another vague answer, another careful deflection that would keep the old man comfortably out of reach. Around them, dozens of Marines remained focused on Thomas Walker. Nobody had returned their attention to the stage. Nobody seemed interested in the symposium schedule anymore. They wanted to hear what came next. Reed offered a thin smile. Then let us narrow it down, he said. What did they call you during your service? Thomas looked at him quietly. The old leather cap remained resting beneath his weathered hands. For several seconds he said nothing. The room grew so still that Reed could hear the faint rattle of an air vent somewhere near the ceiling. Then Thomas spoke. Different people called me different things. A few Marines chuckled again, though the laughter lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. Reed noticed it immediately. The mood had shifted. The audience was no longer laughing at the old man. They were studying him. Reed decided to press harder. Everybody had a call sign, he said. Pilots, operators, recon teams. Somebody must have called you something. Thomas lowered his eyes briefly. For the first time, his expression changed. It was subtle, a distant look. Not sadness, not pride. More like someone opening a door to a room he had not entered in many years. Sunlight from a high window caught the edge of his silver hair. The old man seemed momentarily removed from the auditorium entirely. Reed followed his gaze, but found nothing there except memories he could not see. It has been a long time, Thomas said quietly. A long time for everyone. Marcus Hale felt his pulse quicken. He could not explain why. Something in the old man's voice carried weight. The kind of weight that came from experience rather than authority. Several rows away, a senior master sergeant who had been checking messages on his phone stopped and looked up. Even he appeared interested now. Reed folded his arms tighter. Humor me. The old man looked directly at him. The corners of his eyes tightened slightly. Not in annoyance. In recognition. As though he had met countless young officers just like Nathan Reed over the decades. Officers eager for answers. Eager for certainty. Eager to prove themselves. Thomas nodded once. All right, Captain. The use of his rank caught Reed off guard. He had never introduced himself. Before he could react, Thomas continued. His voice remained calm, measured, barely above conversational volume. Yet every word carried clearly through the room. There was a time when some people called me Iron Viper. The effect was immediate. Most Marines simply stared. A few exchanged confused looks. The name sounded unusual, but nothing more. To them it was just another forgotten call sign from another era. But across the auditorium, Marcus Hale felt every muscle in his body lock. The name hit him like a forgotten memory surfacing from deep water. Iron Viper. He had heard it before. Not recently. Years ago, during an advanced leadership course at Quantico. A guest instructor had mentioned it only once before abruptly moving on. No explanation. No details. Just a name. Iron Viper. Marcus remembered asking about it afterward. The instructor's response had been simple. Some stories are not taught. Marcus stared at Thomas Walker. Suddenly the old man, sitting calmly in the third row, did not seem ordinary at all. Marcus Hale could no longer hear the faint conversations around him. The name echoed through his mind with unsettling clarity. Iron Viper. He remembered sitting in a lecture hall nearly a decade earlier while an aging instructor spoke about leadership under impossible circumstances. The lesson had not been about tactics. It had not been about rank. It had been about responsibility. At one point, the instructor had paused, stared out the window, and mentioned a call sign that almost nobody in the room recognized. Iron Viper. Then he had immediately changed subjects. When Marcus asked afterward who Iron Viper was, the instructor had simply smiled and said that some men became stories long before history learned their names. Standing in the auditorium now, Marcus felt the same chill he had felt that day. Across the room, Thomas Walker remained completely calm. He had not raised his voice. He had not tried to impress anyone. Yet the atmosphere had changed. Captain Nathan Reed noticed it too. The confidence he had carried into the conversation was beginning to crack around the edges. He looked around the room, searching for some sign that the name meant something. Most Marines appeared confused. A few shrugged. Others simply watched Thomas more carefully than before. Reed cleared his throat. Iron Viper, he repeated. That is quite a nickname. Thomas gave a small nod. It was only a call sign. The answer sounded simple. Yet something in the way he said it suggested the subject was already finished. Reed opened his mouth to continue, but Marcus barely heard him. His thoughts had drifted somewhere else entirely. In his mind, he could almost see the faded photograph that had accompanied the lecture years ago. Not a clear image, just fragments. A group of exhausted Marines standing beside a transport aircraft under gray skies. No names, no captions, only a note that an entire team had returned home because one man refused to leave them behind. The details had never been explained. The instructor never described medals. He never described promotions. What he remembered instead was a single sentence. Sometimes leadership means carrying responsibility long after everyone else has gone home. Marcus stared at Thomas Walker. The old man, sitting quietly in the third row, looked nothing like the legend his imagination had built over the years. There were no decorations on display, no signs of importance. Just a weathered jacket, a worn leather cap, and eyes that seemed older than the room itself. Yet somehow that made the memory feel more real. Near the stage, a senior officer who had been reviewing notes for the symposium slowly lowered his folder and turned his attention toward Thomas. One by one, others did the same. Reed sensed the shift immediately. What had started as a simple challenge was becoming something else. He could feel control slipping away from him, though he did not yet understand why. Thomas remained motionless. For a moment his gaze settled on the old cap resting in his hands. His thumb brushed a faded seam along the brim. A distant expression crossed his face. Not pride, not nostalgia, something quieter. The look of a man remembering people rather than events. Then the expression vanished. He looked up again, calm as ever. Across the room, Marcus made a decision. If there was even a chance that this man was connected to the story he remembered, someone needed to know. Slowly and carefully, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Marcus Hale moved carefully toward the side exit of the auditorium, keeping his eyes on Thomas Walker the entire time. The old man remained seated exactly where he had been from the beginning, calm and composed amid the growing tension surrounding him. Captain Nathan Reed was still standing nearby, though the confidence that had fueled the confrontation earlier seemed noticeably diminished. The room had changed. What had started as amusement had become curiosity. Curiosity was slowly becoming something else. Respect was beginning to enter the conversation, though nobody was willing to say it aloud yet. Marcus stepped into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind him. The noise from the auditorium faded instantly. Cool air drifted through the corridor. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors. For a moment, he simply stood there staring at his phone. Then he opened a contact he had not used in over 2 years. Master Gunnery Sergeant William Carter. Retired. One of the instructors from the leadership course at Quantico. Marcus pressed call. The line rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then a familiar voice answered. Marcus. This is unexpected. Marcus glanced back toward the auditorium doors. Sir, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Marcus lowered his voice. Do you remember a call sign from one of your lectures? Silence. Which one? Marcus swallowed. Iron Viper. The response was immediate. The easy warmth vanished from Carter's voice. Where did you hear that? Marcus felt his pulse quicken. There is an old man here at Camp Pendleton. 80s. White hair. Says that was his call sign. Silence returned. Not 1 second. Not 2. Long enough for Marcus to pull the phone away and check whether the connection had dropped. It had not. Finally Carter spoke. Describe him. Marcus did. The jacket. The leather cap. The pale blue eyes. When he finished, another long pause followed. This time it felt heavier. Marcus. Yes, sir. Listen very carefully. Carter's voice had become completely serious. Do not make assumptions. Do not challenge him. And do not let anyone embarrass that man. Marcus felt a chill move through him. Sir, who is he? The retired Marine exhaled slowly. I am not the person who should answer that question. Then who is? Another pause. Hold on. Marcus heard movement on the other end. A chair scraping. A door opening. Muffled voices. Then Carter returned. I need you to repeat exactly what he said. He said people used to call him Iron Viper. Carter did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. Stay where you are. Somebody is going to want more information. Before Marcus could ask another question, the call ended. He stared at the screen. Less than 10 seconds later, his phone vibrated. An incoming number appeared. Not a personal contact. Not a civilian line. A command office. Marcus answered immediately. A calm voice spoke on the other end. Gunnery Sergeant Hale? Yes, sir. We understand there may be an individual attending today's symposium. We need you to confirm something for us. Marcus glanced back toward the auditorium doors. Through the narrow window, he could still see Thomas Walker sitting quietly in the third row while dozens of Marines watched him. The voice continued. Tell us everything he has said since he arrived. Marcus Hale remained in the hallway for nearly 10 minutes, answering questions that seemed increasingly strange. The voice on the command line asked for details nobody would normally care about. What exactly had the old man been wearing? How had he introduced himself? Did he appear confused? Had he mentioned any names? Had he shown any identification? Marcus answered each question carefully. The person on the other end never interrupted, never reacted. Yet with every answer, the pauses between responses grew longer. Finally, the voice thanked him and ended the call. Marcus stared at the dark screen of his phone. Before he could put it away, it vibrated again. Another incoming call. This time the number was blocked. He answered immediately. Gunnery Sergeant Hale. A different voice spoke. Older. Sharper. The kind of voice that carried authority without needing to announce it. You are with the individual now? Yes, sir. Stay nearby. Marcus frowned. Sir. Just stay nearby. The line disconnected. Marcus lowered the phone slowly. Something far above his pay grade was moving. He could feel it. Back inside the auditorium, the atmosphere had become almost surreal. The symposium had technically begun several minutes earlier. A speaker stood near the podium reviewing leadership principles, but almost nobody was paying attention. Eyes kept drifting toward Thomas Walker. The old man had not moved. He sat exactly where he always had, hands resting on the worn leather cap in his lap. Captain Nathan Reed remained nearby. The confidence that had fueled his earlier questions was gone now. Replaced by uncertainty, he struggled to hide. He had expected the call sign to be a punchline. Instead, it had become the center of the room. Reed noticed Marcus returning and immediately stepped toward him. Well, he asked quietly. Marcus hesitated. Well, what? Reed lowered his voice further. You know something. Marcus looked toward Thomas. Maybe. Reed folded his arms. Then share it. Marcus shook his head. I cannot. The answer only deepened Reed's frustration. Before he could respond, movement near the auditorium entrance caught everyone's attention. A colonel had entered the room. Not unusual by itself. Camp Pendleton had no shortage of senior officers. What made it unusual was the fact that he was not attending the symposium. He was searching for someone. The colonel scanned the room once, twice. Then his gaze stopped on Thomas Walker. Marcus noticed it immediately. So did Reed. The colonel's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal recognition. He reached for a phone already in his hand and stepped back into the hallway without speaking to anyone. Reed watched him leave. Did you see that? Marcus nodded slowly. Across the room, Thomas Walker remained completely unaware or completely unconcerned. It was impossible to tell which. The old man simply listened to the speaker at the podium as though nothing unusual was happening around him. A few minutes later, another officer entered. Then another. Neither approached Thomas. Neither joined the symposium. Both looked directly at him before quietly leaving again. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Whispers spread through the auditorium. Marines exchanged confused looks. Even some of the senior staff appeared unsettled. Reed felt a knot forming in his stomach. For the first time since the encounter began, a possibility entered his mind that he had not considered before. What if the old man had been telling the truth from the very beginning? And what if everyone who mattered already knew exactly who he was? The auditorium doors opened again, but this time the reaction was different. Conversations stopped before anyone even understood why. A subtle shift moved through the room like a change in air pressure before a storm. Captain Nathan Reed noticed it immediately. Marines who had been whispering fell silent. Officers who had been seated comfortably straightened in their chairs. Even the speaker at the podium paused for half a second before continuing. Something was happening. Near the entrance stood a man very few people at Camp Pendleton ever saw without advance notice. General Daniel Whitaker had arrived. He was not scheduled to attend the symposium. His name had not appeared anywhere on the agenda. Yet there he was, dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform, accompanied by a single aide who looked unusually tense. Reed felt his stomach tighten. Generals did not alter their schedules for routine events. They certainly did not arrive unannounced. The room rose to attention almost automatically. Chairs shifted. Boots scraped softly across the floor. The familiar rhythm of military courtesy filled the auditorium. Everyone stood except one person. Thomas Walker remained seated. Not out of disrespect, not out of defiance. He simply remained where he was, hands resting on the worn leather cap in his lap. Reed noticed the contrast immediately. A wave of concern passed through him. Surely the old man realized who had just entered. Yet Thomas showed no sign of urgency, no sign of surprise. General Whitaker acknowledged the room with a brief nod. Then he did something unexpected. He did not approach the stage. He did not greet the event organizers. He did not speak with the colonels waiting near the entrance. Instead, he scanned the audience. Once, twice. Then his eyes found Thomas Walker. The general stopped walking. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Reed watched the expression on Whitaker's face change. It was subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, a faint tightening around the jaw. Recognition, real recognition, not the kind reserved for a photograph in a history book, the kind reserved for someone personally important. The general began walking again, straight toward the third row. Marines shifted aside to clear a path. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Marcus Hale felt his pulse pounding in his ears. Every instinct told him he was witnessing something he would remember for the rest of his career. Reed stood frozen. His mind searched desperately for explanations, but none made sense. The general reached the row and stopped directly in front of Thomas Walker. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The silence stretched across the auditorium. Then General Whitaker smiled. It was not the formal smile of a senior officer greeting a guest. It was something far more personal, almost relieved. Thomas looked up at him calmly. The old man's eyes softened slightly. "Daniel," he said. Several Marines exchanged startled looks. No one addressed a general by his first name. No one. Yet Whitaker did not appear offended. If anything, the sound seemed to confirm something. The general exhaled slowly and shook his head with a faint smile. "I was beginning to wonder if you would actually come." Thomas glanced toward the stage. "You invited me." Whitaker nodded. "I did." Around them, confusion spread through the room. Reed felt as though the floor beneath him had shifted. The general looked around the auditorium briefly before returning his attention to Thomas Walker. Then he asked a question that left every Marine listening even more confused than before. "Do they know who you are yet?" Thomas looked toward Reed for the first time in several minutes. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Not yet," he said quietly. "But they are getting close." For several seconds, nobody moved. The entire auditorium seemed suspended between confusion and realization. General Daniel Whitaker stood before Thomas Walker with the ease of a man greeting an old friend rather than a forgotten visitor. Captain Nathan Reed felt every eye in the room shifting between the two men. Questions hung unspoken in the air. The general finally turned toward the audience. His expression remained calm, but there was a gravity in it that immediately commanded attention. "Most of you have spent the last hour trying to figure out who Mr. Walker is," he said. The room remained silent. "The truth is that most of you were never supposed to know." Reed felt a chill run through him. Whitaker looked back at Thomas briefly before continuing. "Many years ago, long before I wore stars on my shoulders, I was a young lieutenant who believed rank meant experience. Then I met a man who taught me otherwise." The general's voice carried effortlessly across the auditorium. "I learned that leadership is not measured by position. It is measured by responsibility. It is measured by sacrifice. And sometimes it is measured by the quiet decision to carry burdens nobody else will ever understand. Not a single Marine moved. Whitaker gestured toward Thomas Walker. The call sign some of you heard today became legendary in places that never appeared in newspapers. Entire teams returned home because this man refused to leave people behind. Entire careers, including my own, were shaped by lessons he taught without ever asking for recognition. Reed felt his face grow warm. Every sarcastic remark he had made replayed in his memory. Every assumption. Every judgment. Across the room, Marcus Hale lowered his eyes. Even he had only seen a fraction of the truth. The general took a slow breath. What makes this remarkable is not what he did. It is what happened afterward. He never wrote books. Never chased attention. Never introduced himself with titles. He simply went home and lived his life. A faint smile crossed Whitaker's face, which is exactly what he would prefer us to focus on. Soft laughter moved through the audience. Thomas shook his head slightly, almost embarrassed by the attention. Then something unexpected happened. Captain Nathan Reed stepped forward. The movement drew every eye in the room. He stopped in front of Thomas Walker. For a moment, he seemed unable to find the right words. Finally, he stood straight and spoke quietly. "Sir, I owe you an apology." Thomas looked up at him. Reed continued, "I thought I understood who belonged in this room. I was wrong." The old man studied him for a second before a faint smile appeared. "That happens to all of us, Captain." The answer carried no anger, no bitterness, only understanding. Reed nodded slowly. Around the auditorium, Marines remained standing. Not because anyone ordered them to, because respect had replaced curiosity. General Whitaker looked around the room one final time. "Remember this day," he said, "because the greatest people you will ever meet rarely announce themselves." Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The kind that cannot be commanded. Thomas Walker picked up his worn leather cap and rose slowly to his feet. The room remained still as he started toward the exit. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody needed to. They simply watched him go. And long after the doors closed behind him, the lesson remained. Some names become legends, but the men who deserve them often spend their lives pretending they are ordinary.